Story 1. This story comes from a former detective, someone who spent years on the force in a big city before finally walking away from the job. He always seemed steady, like nothing could shake him. But there was one night that he never liked talking about. I managed to get it out of him over a drink one time, and it still sticks with me. We'll call him Officer Grady. Grady was working the late shift on a Tuesday, the kind of night where the streets are empty and the city feels like it's holding its breath. He was patrolling one of the rougher neighborhoods. Lots of boarded-up houses, broken streetlights, and empty lots. The kind of place where things happen in the dark, and nobody talked about it the next day. Around midnight, he got a call on his radio. It wasn't anything big, just a welfare check. Someone had called 911 saying they hadn't heard from a neighbor in days, and they were worried. It wasn't uncommon, especially in that area. People kept to themselves, but when someone went missing for long enough, someone else eventually noticed. The house was on the edge of town, at the end of a long, dead-end street. The place had seen better days. Peeling paint, overgrown lawn, windows that hadn't been cleaned in years. Grady pulled up, killed the engine, and sat for a minute, looking at the house. Something about it gave him a bad feeling, but he shook it off. It was probably just some old guy who'd gone out of town or was sick. He'd check it out, make sure everything was fine, and be on his way. As he walked up the cracked driveway, his flashlight cut through the darkness, bouncing off the grimy windows. He knocked on the door. Police. Anyone home? Nothing. No sound at all. The neighborhood was dead silent. Not even the usual distant hum of traffic. He knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. Grady stepped back, eyeing the windows. He could feel that something wasn't right. The door wasn't locked, so he pushed it open. Immediately, the smell hit him. It was that unmistakable, sickly sweet odor of decay. He'd been a cop long enough to know what it meant. He stepped inside, hand on his gun, flashlight cutting through the gloom. The house was dark, except for a faint glow coming from a room at the end of the hallway. He moved cautiously, the floor creaking under his boots. The living room was a mess, junk everywhere, old furniture, a layer of dust over everything. It looked like nobody had been in there for weeks, maybe months. But that smell, it was fresh. Something had happened here recently. As Grady moved toward the light, his heart started pounding. He reached the doorway and peered inside. The light was coming from a flickering TV, its screen showing static. In front of it was a single chair, and in the chair sat a man, slumped over, his back to the door. Grady's stomach turned. The man wasn't moving, and from the look of him, he hadn't moved in days. The body was starting to bloat, the skin a sickly gray. His head was angled weirdly, like his neck had been twisted. Grady radioed into dispatch, requesting backup, his voice tight, trying to keep it together. That's when he heard it, a faint creak from upstairs. Someone else was in the house. Grady's blood ran cold. He drew his gun, stepping quietly away from the body and toward the stairs. He knew backup would take at least 10 minutes to get there. He was on his own. The stairs groaned under his weight as he ascended, his gun aimed up the narrow stairwell. He reached the top and paused. The hallway was dark, but he could see light spilling out from under a door at the far end. Another creak, louder this time. Someone was moving around in that room. He inched forward, gun raised, every muscle tense. His mouth was dry, his breath shallow. As he reached the door, he heard whispering, low, frantic, like someone talking to themselves. Grady's heart pounded in his ears as he slowly reached for the doorknob, twisting it quietly. The door creaked open, and Grady's flashlight illuminated the small bedroom. It was a mess, like the rest of the house, but there, in the corner, was a figure huddled on the floor, facing away from him. A man, his hands covered in blood, rocking back and forth, whispering to himself. Grady aimed his gun at the man. Police! Don't move! The man didn't react, just kept rocking, his hands twitching as he mumbled incoherently. Grady's skin crawled. He stepped closer, keeping his gun trained on the guy, ready for anything. Hey, turn around. Hands where I can see them. Suddenly, the man stopped rocking. His whole body went still, like a puppet with its strings cut. Slowly, he turned his head to look over his shoulder, his face half lit by the flashlight. His eyes were wide, wild, and his mouth twisted into a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "They're gone," the man whispered. "They're all gone now." Grady's heart skipped a beat. "Who's gone? What did you do?" The man just laughed, a quiet, shaky laugh that made Grady's skin crawl. His bloody hands flexed, and then he spoke again, more frantic this time. "I took care of it. They wouldn't stop screaming, so I made them stop. I made them quiet." Grady's grip tightened on the gun. "Stand up. Hands behind your head. Now." But the man didn't move. Instead, he pointed to the closet, his smile fading. "In there. They're still in there. Quiet now." Grady's blood went cold as he backed toward the closet door, gun still trained on the man. He reached out, yanked open the closet door, and his flashlight beam landed on something that made his stomach lurch. Inside were two bodies, a woman and a child, both bound and gagged, their eyes wide open, staring lifelessly at the floor. The blood hadn't dried yet. Grady's breath caught in his throat, and in that split second of horror, the man lunged. Grady barely had time to react as the man charged at him, his bloody hands reaching for the gun. They grappled, the man screaming incoherently, clawing at Grady's face, trying to wrestle the weapon away. Grady fought back, slamming the man into the wall, his grip slipping. The gun went off, a deafening crack in the small room, and the man collapsed, clutching his stomach, blood seeping through his fingers. Grady stumbled back, breath ragged, adrenaline surging through his veins. The man gasped for air, his crazed eyes still locked on Grady as he choked out his final words. They wouldn't stop screaming. Grady stood there, heart racing, as the room fell silent, save for the ringing in his ears. Backup arrived moments later, but it was already over. The investigation revealed that the man had been living in the house with his wife and child, but something had snapped in him. He'd killed them days before, left their bodies in the closet, and sat downstairs with the TV on, as if nothing had happened. Grady never forgot that night. He'd seen a lot of terrible things over the years, but that look in the man's eyes, that twisted, broken grin, was something that haunted him. Because sometimes, the scariest thing you can find on a routine call isn't a criminal or a drug deal. It's something far worse, the quiet madness of a mind that's completely lost control. Story 2. This story was told to me by a retired cop, a man who had seen more than his share of bad nights. But this night, it was the one that almost broke him. We'll call him Detective Miller. It was a routine patrol, or at least that's what it was supposed to be. Miller had been with the department for over 20 years at that point, the kind of guy who had seen it all and didn't rattle easily. This town wasn't exactly crime central. Small, quiet, with more drug busts than anything truly violent. But this was different. It was a little after midnight, and Miller was driving the back roads near the edge of town, not expecting much. His shift was almost over, and he was looking forward to heading home. Then, his radio crackled to life. Units respond to a possible break-in at the Ridgewood Warehouse, West Side. Suspects may still be on the premises. The Ridgewood Warehouse was an old, half-abandoned building on the outskirts of town. It used to be a distribution center for some big company years back, but now was mostly empty, a perfect spot for junkies or teenagers looking for trouble. Miller responded. Detective Miller en route. He was only a few minutes away and figured he'd scare off a couple of kids, maybe take one back to the station. Routine stuff. But as he pulled into the warehouse lot, he noticed something was off. There was a van parked near the loading dock, engine running, lights off. Not the kind of vehicle local kids would use for some late-night fun. Miller parked a little ways off, cut the lights, and grabbed his flashlight. As he moved closer to the building, the hairs on the back of his neck started to rise. Something was wrong here. He radioed for backup but knew it could take a while for anyone else to show. Approaching the van, Miller could see movement inside, shadows shifting in the front seat. His pulse quickened. This wasn't a couple of teenagers. He drew his gun, keeping it low as he crept up to the driver's side window. The person inside, A man wearing a ski mask hadn't seen him yet. Miller's mind raced. What were they planning? Robbery? Drugs? Something worse? In a flash, he raised his gun and slammed his palm against the window. Police! Hands where I can see them. The driver froze, then lunged for something in the passenger seat. Miller didn't wait to find out what. He yanked open the door and grabbed the guy by the collar, dragging him out of the van and throwing him to the ground. Don't move, Miller barked, his gun trained on the man's head. But before he could cuff him, there was movement from the loading dock. Two more figures appeared, both armed, running toward him. It was an ambush. Miller barely had time to react before the first shot cracked through the night. The bullet whizzed past his ear, too close for comfort. He dropped behind the van for cover, adrenaline pumping through his veins. He fired back, his shot slamming into the side of the warehouse, keeping the gunman pinned down. The guy he had pulled from the van was scrambling on the ground, trying to crawl away. Miller had no time for him now. He peeked around the corner of the van, just in time to see one of the shooters dart toward the loading dock entrance. Miller fired again, 2 quick shots, and one of the men dropped, clutching his leg. The other ducked behind a stack of crates, taking cover as more gunfire erupted. The quiet night was shattered by the deafening blasts of bullets ricocheting off metal and concrete. Miller's heart pounded in his chest. He was outnumbered, pinned down, and backup was still too far away. But he wasn't going down without a fight. He moved fast, keeping low, making his way around the side of the van. The gunman behind the crates fired wildly, missing by inches, bullets sparking off the ground near his feet. Miller ducked behind a rusted-out truck, breathing hard, trying to figure out his next move. He had to neutralize the second shooter before things got worse. The guy was shouting to his partner, telling him to get the van moving. Miller could hear the panic in his voice. These weren't seasoned criminals. They were sloppy, jittery. That was his advantage. He glanced up, saw the shooter reloading behind the crates, and made his move. He bolted from cover, charging straight toward him. The guy barely had time to react before Miller tackled him, slamming him into the ground with a thud. The gun skittered out of his hand as Miller pinned him down. Stay down, Miller growled, cuffing him quickly. He didn't have time to celebrate. The driver, the first guy, had gotten to his feet and was scrambling toward the van, trying to make a getaway. Miller grabbed the fallen gunman's weapon and fired at the van's tires. The sharp pop of the bullet hitting rubber was followed by the hiss of air escaping, and the van lurched to a stop. But the driver wasn't giving up. He grabbed a shotgun from inside the van and swung it toward Miller, firing wildly. The blast ripped through the air, hitting the side of the truck Miller had used for cover. Shrapnel flew, cutting into Miller's cheek, but he didn't stop. Miller fired back, and the shotgun-wielding driver dropped to the ground with a scream, clutching his shoulder. The fight was over. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Miller stood there, breathing hard, gun still raised, as the adrenaline began to fade. He wiped the blood from his cheek, heart still hammering in his chest. It was over. He had taken down 3 armed men, and he was still standing. When backup arrived, they secured the scene, and Miller was finally able to piece together what had happened. The warehouse had been the target of a drug deal gone bad. The van was filled with stolen goods, and the men were armed and desperate. They had been waiting for their buyers, but when things started to fall apart, they decided to take matters into their own hands. Miller had walked into a hornet's nest without even knowing it, and if he hadn't acted fast, he might not have walked out at all. He never forgot that night, not because of the violence or the bloodshed, but because of how close he came to not making it out. Even after years on the job, that night reminded him just how dangerous it could be when you least expected it. Story 3. This one comes from a small-town officer, someone who had been working in a rural area for years, dealing mostly with drunk drivers, domestic disputes, and the occasional drug bust. He never expected to find himself in the middle of a full-blown nightmare on a quiet night shift. We'll call him Officer Daniels. It was a Wednesday, the middle of the week, and the town was dead. Daniels had been parked at the side of the road for the last hour, half listening to the radio chatter and waiting for something to happen. His town was a speck on the map, where nothing much ever did happen. Then, just after midnight, the radio crackled with a call from dispatch. A farmer had reported seeing strange lights and movement near his property, which bordered a stretch of dense woods that ran along the county line. People occasionally reported weird things out there: hunters, hikers, sometimes even teenagers messing around. But this time, the farmer said the lights were inside an old, abandoned cabin deep in the woods, a place nobody had lived in for years. Daniel sighed, rubbed his tired eyes, and answered the call. "Daniel's here, I'll check it out." He wasn't looking forward to a late-night trek through the woods, but it sounded like some kids messing around. Probably nothing serious. The farm was about 10 minutes outside of town, and Daniels pulled into the long dirt driveway just as the sky started to cloud over, blocking out the moonlight. The farmer, an older man named Hank, was waiting outside his house with a flashlight. "I don't know what it is, officer," Hank said, his voice low and shaky. "I saw some lights in that old cabin, and I swear I heard voices, but no one's lived there for years. Figured I should call." Daniels nodded, trying to reassure him. "Probably just some kids. I'll head out there and take a look." He got out of the car, grabbed his flashlight, and started walking toward the woods. The cabin was about half a mile into the trees, and the trail was barely visible in the dark. The deeper he went, the quieter it got. Even the usual sounds of the forest, crickets, distant owls, seemed to fade away, leaving only the crunch of his boots on the underbrush. Daniels didn't like it. There was a strange tension in the air, the kind that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. But he kept moving, telling himself it was just the isolation and the late hour messing with his head. After what felt like forever, he saw the faint glow of a light through the trees. The cabin was just ahead, a small, dilapidated structure that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. But the light was real, flickering from inside the cabin, and now he could hear the faint murmur of voices. He radioed in, "Dispatch, this is Daniels. I'm approaching the cabin now. Looks like there's activity inside. I'll investigate." He moved closer, keeping his flashlight low, his hand resting on his holster. As he reached the edge of the clearing, he crouched behind a tree and peered through the cracked window of the cabin. What he saw made his blood run cold. Inside were 3 men, all armed with rifles, huddled around a table covered in maps and what looked like bags of money. The men were rough-looking, covered in dirt, and talking in hushed, hurried tones. Daniel's mind raced. This wasn't kids playing around. These men looked dangerous, like they were planning something big. His heart started pounding as he realized he was outnumbered and outgunned. He didn't have time to call for backup. If they saw him, there was no telling what they'd do. He needed to get out of there, fast, and get back up. Just as he started to back away, his foot hit a branch, snapping it with a loud crack. The sound echoed through the clearing. Instantly, the men inside went silent. One of them rushed to the window, yanking back the tattered curtain. Daniels froze, holding his breath, praying they wouldn't see him. But it was too late. "There's someone out there," the man shouted, and in a heartbeat, they were grabbing their rifles, storming toward the door. Daniels didn't wait to see what would happen next. He bolted back into the woods, his flashlight swinging wildly as he ran. Behind him, he heard the cabin door slam open, followed by the sharp crack of gunfire. Bullets whizzed past him, thudding into the trees as he ducked and zigzagged through the underbrush, trying to stay low. "Get him!" one of the men shouted, their voices angry, getting closer. Daniel's lungs burned as he sprinted through the woods, branches slashing at his face. He couldn't stop, couldn't slow down. He needed to make it back to the car, get to safety. But the men were gaining on him, their footsteps pounding behind him. Another shot rang out, hitting a tree just inches from his head. Daniels veered to the right, slipping down a small hill, trying to put distance between himself and his pursuers. His mind raced. He had to think of something fast, or he wouldn't make it out of these woods alive. Up ahead, he saw an old, dried-up creek bed. He ducked into it, crouching low behind a fallen log, holding his breath as he listened to the men crashing through the trees above him. They were close. Too close. "We know you're out there, cop," one of them yelled. "Come out now, and maybe we'll let you walk out of here alive." Daniels didn't move. He could hear the men spreading out, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, searching for him. Sweat dripped down his face as he waited, heart pounding so loud he was sure they'd hear it. One of the men passed by, his boots just inches from where Daniels was hiding. He held his breath, praying the guy wouldn't look down. The beam of the flashlight swept across the log, then moved on. The man kept walking, muttering curses under his breath. Daniels waited until he was sure they had moved far enough away. Then slowly, carefully, he crept out of the creek bed. He was about halfway back to the farm, and if he could just stay quiet, he might be able to make it out before they realized he was gone. But then he heard the sound of an engine, a truck, rumbling to life. They were getting into their vehicle. He had no time left. He had to move now. He sprinted the last stretch through the woods, the truck's headlights cutting through the trees behind him. His legs felt like they were on fire, but he pushed through, running harder than he ever had in his life. The farmhouse came into view, and so did his patrol car. Just as he reached his car, the truck roared into the clearing, headlights blinding him as it skidded to a stop. The men jumped out, rifles raised, and Daniels didn't hesitate. He dove behind his car, pulling his gun from its holster, and fired. The first shot hit one of the men in the leg, dropping him to the ground with a scream. The other two ducked behind the truck, returning fire. Bullets slammed into his patrol car, shattering the windows. Daniels crouched low, breathing hard, trying to get a clear shot. One of the men made a run for it, trying to circle around the car, but Daniels was ready. He fired again, hitting the guy in the shoulder. The man fell to the ground, clutching his wound. The last man, the one who had shouted for him earlier, was still behind the truck, firing blindly in Daniels' direction. Daniels steadied his aim, waited for the right moment, and then pop, a clean shot. The man went down. The truck's engine sputtered and died. The gunfire stopped. Daniels stood there, gun still raised, breathing hard, surrounded by shattered glass and bullet casings. It was over. Backup arrived a few minutes later, but by then, the scene was secure. Two of the men were alive, injured but cuffed, and the third was dead, lying face down in the dirt. It turned out the men were part of a crew planning to rob several farms in the area, using the cabin as their hideout. They hadn't expected to be caught, and when Daniel showed up, they panicked. Daniel survived that night, but it changed him. He had never been in a shootout before, never felt it close to death. That empty stretch of woods, the sound of those rifles cracking through the night, it haunted him for months after. He knew how lucky he had been to make it out alive. Because in a town where nothing ever happens, the one night it does can be the night that changes everything. The life of a cop is unpredictable. Each call could be routine, or it could turn deadly in an instant. From late-night shootouts to facing down armed criminals alone, officers like Grady and Daniels faced dangers most of us could never imagine. These men and women worked tirelessly, often risking their lives, to protect the people and communities they serve, navigating situations where every decision could be a matter of life or death. Next time you see a police officer, remember the courage it takes to do their job. Show your appreciation for the hard work they put in to keep us safe. Whether it's a simple thank you or supporting them in your community, let's stand behind the people who stand on the front lines every day. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this.